Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming along to our first event after the summer break. I hope you appreciate some of the refurbs that have gone on whilst you've all been away. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Azadeh Moaveni, who's going to chair tonight's discussion. Azadeh is a journalist and author. She's covered Iran for the past decade for Time magazine, amongst other publications. Before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are streaming tonight's discussion live on our YouTube channel. So over to Azadeh.
Thank you, Millie. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming in this middle of this rainy evening. It's great to be here with you, and I was just recalling 2 or 3 years ago, we had a similar conversation about similar issues, but it was then countdown to war. So now we've arrived at after the deal. I'm going to introduce the panel to you all, and then everyone's going to say a few words, and then we'll all start our discussion. So Kasra Naji, to my right, is special correspondent for BBC Persian, has reported in Iran and around the world for many years. He's the author of one of the best books, perhaps the only, but certainly the best books on Ahmedinejad, The Secret History of Iran's Radical Leader. To his right, Con Coughlin is the Telegraph's defense editor and chief foreign commentator. He is the author of several books, including Churchill's First War, Young Winston and the Fight Against the Taliban, a book about Saddam, his rise and fall, and Khomeini's ghost, about the Iranian Revolution and the rise of militant Islam. To this side, we have James Rubin, writer, commentator, and lecturer on world affairs and U.S. foreign policy. He contributes now a weekly column to the Sunday Times and served under President Clinton as Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs and Chief Spokesman for Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Saeed Kamali Dehqan is a staff journalist with The Guardian. He is their able writer on everything Iranian. Previously wrote from the Iranian capital of Tehran, did excellent work during the Green Movement uprising, and is now based in London and was named in 2010 Journalist of the Year, the Foreign Press Association. So I think, Saeed, why don't we start with you? If you can just, talk a few minutes about what you think is most relevant after years of negotiations, finally reaching this deal. It's tremendously nerve-wracking for some in the region, and it's contentious in the West. So why don't you start?
So today we had the news that the 34th Democrat senator in the U.S. declared her support. So it means that the motion to disapprove the deal will hopefully not pass, and the deal would survive. That's certainly good news. I think it's the deal is a good deal, and I think it's good for the peace in the region, and I think it's good for Iran, for the future of Iran. Finally, both sides have overcome mistrust, and they reached a deal. When I was in Iran, I never thought that in my life I would see an Iranian foreign minister talking to a U.S. Secretary of State, and now it's part of the routine. So things have dramatically changed. And the Iran deal, I think it's important in a different aspect as well. I want to make an analogy, which is last century, around this time of last century, there was a big case in France that divided opinions. That was the Dreyfus affair, where people in Britain, France, Europe know about. I read about the Dreyfus affair when I was reading Proust in Tehran. When I was reading La Recherche, Dreyfus affair plays a very important role in the novel because that was the case with divided families, divided the society a lot. Even in the book, the Proust book, you have the narrator and the swan, supporting the Dreyfus, becoming a Dreyfusard, and then you had the anti-Dreyfusard in the same family. You had, the narrator's father who proposed it. And I think that Iran's nuclear deal is Iran's dreyfus moment, albeit in the 21st century, in the sense that it is dividing opinions in a massive scale, where you have senators opposing the administrations. You have Obama passionately defending it in his American university speech. You had a selection of rabbis declaring their support, another promising to march against it. You had even Ben and Jerry supporting the Iran deal. So it is interesting in terms of how it's dividing a nation, specifically in the U.S. It isn't as much polarizing in Iran. There are a minority of Iranians who opposed it. There was a letter that was published, I think, in Politico, signed by a number of Iranian dissidents who said this is not good. But the majority of Iranians are supporting it. And I personally support it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Jamie?
Well, it's nice to hear the deal described in these dramatic terms from the Iranian perspective, and I suspect if I were an Iranian, I might, who was not thrilled with the way things had been going and desperately wanted to see Iran enter slowly but surely the international community, I might say the same thing. But from an American perspective, or arguably from a Western perspective, I think there's been a lot of overhyped discussion of this agreement. It's worth remembering that the basic concept of suspending sanctions for limitations on Iran's nuclear program was supported by George W. Bush and was the premise of the agreement that was being pursued in the 2005, 6, 7, and 8 period. Now, it's been filled out. There are a lot more details. And as you said, the Secretary of State is meeting with the foreign minister. At that time, it was a deputy American, I guess he was Undersecretary of State Bill Burns was meeting with Jalili. So to an American, this is not the dramatic step forward. This is an evolutionary, positive arms control agreement. And I see it that way. My first job out of graduate school was to do nuclear arms control between the Soviet Union and the United States. I did my missiles and my ABM treaty and my SALT II and SALT I and all the different modifications of Soviet missiles and American missiles. I knew all that stuff. To me, this is a lot like that. It is, and back then in 1977, 78, when the SALT II agreement was being debated by the Congress, or was going to be debated, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States were asked their position, and they said it was modest but useful. And I think that would be understating it. But I think it's closer to modest but useful than it is to some of the hyperbolic statements that have been made by President Obama, by some people in the West who have compared it to Richard Nixon's opening to China and things like that. We don't know what will come after this agreement. I don't know, and those who I respect who understand the Iranian government don't know either. And if I were to bet, I bet the Iranian government doesn't know what's going to come next, because there is serious debate within that government with the revolutionary Iranian regime side seeing this agreement as troubling because it might impact their activities in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. While the more moderate side, the Rouhani, who basically deserves the credit for changing the reality, I'm a simple guy. Before Rouhani was president, we had Ahmedinejad. Nobody wanted to talk to him. Nobody wanted to make a deal with him. Rouhani was elected, and pretty much the same basic outline of an agreement has been struck. And so to me, Rouhani's election was what changed things. Not Obama's election, not the United States position, not John Kerry's heroics. What happened was that the Iranian people were allowed to elect a president who was determined to change things, and he did. And he allowed and received permission for the foreign minister to meet with the Secretary of State for a number of agreements to be made within this larger context of suspending sanctions for limitations on the program. So that's what this is to me. People forget, and it's worth saying, and I'll say it very cleanly, Iran could have built a nuclear weapon for a long time now. If you go back 4, 5, 6, 7 years during that Bush era, the Israeli government threshold for Iran's reaching a nuclear threshold was the engineering capability to enrich uranium. Once you can do that, you can build a nuclear bomb. Well, they reached that years ago. And although, you know, the hardliners in America don't like when I say this, they've chosen for the moment not to build a nuclear weapon. That's what the Iranian position is. What does this agreement do? It makes it harder for them to build a nuclear weapon if they choose to. Not impossible, harder. It makes it easier for us to detect such an effort if they choose to. And it gives them a lot of reasons not to make that decision. On the positive side, sanctions relief. On the negative side, sanctions being replaced. And that's what the agreement does. And all the different provisions put in place by very serious technical experts, which I support, are basically in that framework. Harder to make a bomb, easier for us to detect, and good reasons not to. But not, and these are the words of, unfortunately, President Obama, prevent Iran from building a nuclear bomb or having a nuclear weapon, and all the other rhetoric that we've seen. And it is not, in my view, a reason to think that Iran's policy in the region, and I'm sure that's a lot of what you want to talk about, is going to change. I don't see the Revolutionary Guard stopping its effort to allow Bashar Assad to stay in power, despite the fact that almost half the refugees that are coming into this country that we're talking about are his fault, and by extension Iran's fault, for propping up a regime that's a murderous regime that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. And that is what they want to continue to be able to do, defend Bashar Assad and his family. It's not necessarily going to stop Iran from seeking to have maximum influence in Iraq, from controlling to the extent possible Lebanon, and I've always thought that Yemen was a little exaggerated, from, let's call it, playing a role in Yemen. So that has nothing to do with this. This is an arms control agreement. And and I think Kerry made a mistake in overselling it. And had they simply described it as an arms control agreement that may or may not yield greater progress, they could hope for it, but not expect it, I don't think it would have been so close. I mean, remember, the big victory today is that the president has enough votes to stop the Congress from blocking the agreement. 34 out of 100. That's all that happened. And it's likely that a majority of the House, a majority of the Senate are going to vote against this agreement. That's not a strong endorsement. It will go through, and the administration will be able to keep it going, and the Europeans will do their share. But it's not an endorsement of history-making breakthroughs of foreign relations. It's a step. It's a modest step. It's a good step. But I'd urge people not to overstate it.
Thank you. Kasra,
Yes, I agree mostly with what Jamie just said, but I also believe that from the Iranian perspective, this deal is a big deal. It's a big deal because Iran, by signing up to this deal in Vienna, they agreed for all intents and purposes that they will not have the capability to build a bomb. They basically signed up to foregoing that choice that they had. That was the deal. They decided to, okay, we're not going to build a bomb in return for lifting of the sanctions. Lifting of the sanctions is a big, big thing for Iran these days. And my view is that Ayatollah Khamenei and the other leaders in Iran knew that if things continued the way they were going, the whole stability of the regime was at stake. They had to make a big decision, and they made that big decision. They didn't make it in Vienna, they made it in Lausanne, when they agreed basically to the outline of lifting of the sanctions in return for giving up the capability to build a bomb. They couldn't build a bomb yet. They were working on it, and I think they were probably a few years away from it, because in my view, at least as much as I know about it, is that it's not enough to have enough enriched uranium. You need to actually build the bomb. You actually need to put it on some kind of a missile or some delivery system to deliver it. All those things have not been done yet. Iran doesn't have that capability. And they were working towards that. But the sanctions intervened, and they were causing major trouble. And they had to make a decision whether they want to go on this path or change tack on this particular thing and save the regime and save its whole sort of strategy in the regime. You talked about Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and all that. Those things, I agree, they will continue. That hasn't changed. Iran will do what it has been doing for years. But the important thing is that it has given up this ambition of building the bomb. And that is a big deal in Iran, because there are hardliners in Iran who all the time, throughout these years, they were hoping that they will get there. And now suddenly they are in a situation whereby they have to sort of agree and give up on that ambition. And I'm not sure, this is the interesting thing within the Iranian politics. I'm not sure how that is going to be played out, in a sense that the Revolutionary Guards, the commanders, many of them, and the other hardliners within the Iranian regime, they have given up on some ambition that they had for many years, and they suddenly are without it. They cannot do it, and they see that the government, Rouhani and his team, with the backing of Khamenei, they have given up on that. And I'm not sure how happy or unhappy they are. I'm sure they are pretty unhappy, actually. But how?
Who's the they in this case?
The hardliners in Iran. But what can they do is we have to basically wait and see, and that's probably the reason why Khamenei has been sort of standing on the fence, generally not taking a position in support or against this thing, waiting to see how the whole internal politics is going to be played out. So it's not a done deal in Iran in a sense that it looks as if it is in America, but it's going that way. I think Khamenei generally wants it because the whole stability of the regime was at risk. But he's waiting. He's waiting to see whether they can actually go through with this.
It's always a great pleasure to go last when you've got a team like this on the. What left is there to say? I really sympathise with what Saeed said in his opening remarks about, and I mean, I haven't been to Iran since the late 80s when I covered the Iran-Iraq war. And then I wrote something that offended the Ayatollahs, and I haven't had a visa since. I haven't been one of the journalists who's been given a visa to go back to celebrate the nuclear deal. But what I did learn when I was in Iran, that Iran is a wonderful country, full of wonderful people. with a rather terrible regime. And my view hasn't changed. I haven't been back there. I'd love to go back there. If anybody here is from the Iranian embassy watching proceedings, I'd like a visa, please. And this is coming back to your point. This is where we are with this deal. I mean, I think Jamie made some very good points about this being basically an oversold nuclear arms deal. But we are at a very early stage. I mean, okay, it might stagger through Congress like a wounded beast. We don't know what's going to happen in Tehran, coming back to your point with the internal politics in Tehran. But it is a good deal for Iran, Saeed. It's a bad deal for everybody else, as far as I can see. It's a bad deal for the West because, let us not forget, Rouhani was elected to get the sanctions lifted. So he goes off to do the negotiations. The whole deal is predicated on you get rid of your capabilities to build nuclear weapons and we lift the sanctions. That's the deal he's got. If I was an Iranian, if I was a member of the regime, I would be dancing in the streets to this deal. It does not build confidence, I don't think, for the West. We still, we don't want to get too detailed here, but when you look at the verification process, the Iranians are basically going to control the verification process. If we have any concerns about the verification process, which, as I said, I don't want to get too technical, but the verification process is crucial because once Iran has been verified that it's put all the really important bits of its nuclear program into cold storage, and the IAEA in Vienna will authorize that, then the sanctions come off. But when you actually look at the nitty-gritty, the Iranians have a lot of influence in the verification process. So, for example, if a UN inspector says, well, we don't like what's going on in Parchin, is that how you pronounce it?
Parchin, yes.
Parchin. The military base where they're building the rockets and the detonators and all the other bits and pieces you need, as you said, to deliver a nuclear weapon. If the inspectors say we're not very happy about this, well, then we have to go to the Iranians and say we're not very happy, and they will look at what we've got, and they will decide whether it's actually justified, whether our complaints are justified. So this verification process is not very reassuring to a lot of people. But I think the really big problem with this deal is the message it's sending out to the rest of the region. And we've touched briefly on what Iran is doing in Iraq, what Iran is doing in Syria, supporting a president who's regularly dropping barrel bombs on his people. I mean, is this a regime that is serious about engaging with the international community in a constructive way? But the really big elephant in the room is what is this deal going to do to the other Arab powers in the region, the Egypts and the Saudi Arabias, and further afield the Turkeys? How are they going to respond to this? Because with an American president who's basically gone AWOL in the region and signed up a deal because he can't be bothered to really push the Iranians on the detail to get an agreement that really satisfies everyone in the region and the West that there is no more of an aspiration in Tehran to develop a nuclear weapon. Without that, you really fear that the Saudis will go to Pakistan and get a nuclear bomb, the Egyptians will do their thing, the Turks will do their thing, and we've got a far more serious problem on our hands, far greater than just trying to get 34 senators to sign up to what I think is a rather dodgy deal.
Yeah, let's take up, I mean, the details are complicated. I mean, it involves centrifuges and,
We can argue about centrifuges for the next 2 hours.
No, we don't want to argue about centrifuges. So I think we should perhaps just deal with what would the alternatives have been to this deal? Would no deal have been better, and where would that have left us? Does this deal, flawed though some of us may think it is, still reduce the chances of Iran building or weaponizing in the next 15 years? Will it, in time, create the possibility that an Iran that is more integrated into the world, more integrated into the international economy, will be less inclined to be behaving as it does in the region, backing Assad, backing different kinds of militant groups. So first, yeah, I think we should deal with the deal itself. You know, is it terribly dodgy, and where would we be if we had no deal at all? Wouldn't that be worse?
Khan's a terrific guy. I love your
Oh,
writing.
God. What's coming now? He works for Sunday Times. I work for the Telegraph.
But-
You know, it's fairly obvious what's coming
But
now.
arms control is something I've been doing for 30 years. And you're right that in one particular area called undeclared sites, that means places where nobody knows there's any activity going on.
The
Now remember,
unknown
hold on, let me finish. Nuclear material, luckily, is one of the easiest things in the world to detect. And it's basically through what we used to call a Geiger counter. Radioactive material is extremely difficult to hide. You just can't do it. Once you've all seen all the movies where they figure out from this little piece of radioactive material, where was it made, who made it, in which location, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not like, let's call other issues like chemical weapons, biological weapons, where that stuff is very difficult to distinguish between what's for health purposes and what's for a weapon. This is verifiable stuff. We've been doing this for 40 years. We will have a look at what they call the entire nuclear supply chain.
Including Parchin?
Let me finish. There's no nuclear supply chain there.
No.
There are people who think there were
That we know of.
Let me hold on. That there were military activities there to possibly build a warhead. And this is why I'm sorry, I don't agree with you either. There is a timeline that is well known to the intelligence community of Iran's nuclear program. And that was, they were building and building and building and building the reactors and developing the enrichment capability and developing the ability to enrich all the way to 95%, which is what you have to do. And then in 2003, after George Bush invaded Iraq, they got scared and they stopped. And they began to make a decision to stop the weaponization part of their program. And that's when the tests occurred at Parchin, and the intelligence community has, very hard evidence that a decision was made at that time. But they kept, and this is why I'm sorry, I don't think this is right, the capability to enrich uranium. And if you can do that, then an MIT student can turn that into a nuclear weapon. You wouldn't, if you were a country like Iran, want him to. You'd want to have weaponization and missiles and all that. But what the point I'm making here is that the hard part is the being able to enrich uranium to 95% in sufficient quantities to create a nuclear weapon. And that they will still have after this agreement. They will have lots of capability, and if they decided to ramp it up and break the deal within X number of months, they would have a nuclear bomb's worth of enriched uranium. So the decision to stop the bomb making was in 2003, not in 2015. What's happened now, and this is to take the other side of the coin where you'll be happier. It's harder than you think to get a better deal from Iran. People have been trying to get them to give up their nuclear weapons capability. They don't need all this stuff for medical research, for power.
Quite right.
They spent billions and billions of dollars on this capability to enrich uranium, and we couldn't get them to give it up completely. And 10 years have gone by, and someone had to decide, is it better to keep trying and knocking our heads against the wall? They, if you understand Iran, think of it like in 1953 on the oil price. They ruined their own economy in order to fight the British over the price of oil and the percentage they would get. So they made a decision as a matter of national honor, they can take it. They went to war with Iraq for 10 years, they can take it. They were not about to collapse. They were worried about what would happen. They didn't want their country to be in sanction. In short, they made a compromise. We made a compromise. We weren't going anywhere. And will it lead, and I'll stop now and let others speak, will it lead to the larger regional thing? I have to repeat what I said before. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think they know for the reasons that you said, which is the internal negotiation in exchange for giving up this possibility for 10 to 15 years hasn't really played itself out.
Okay, if I may,
Quickly, please,
Yes.
because we're going to other.
well, of course, I disagree with Khan. You know, that would something you would
That's what I'm
expect
here
from. That's something you would expect from a Guardian journalist and a Telegraph journalist, perhaps. I think the idea that you are part of the regime to celebrate and dance in the streets is disillusion. It's a misrepresentation. It's distorting the fact.
It was a joke.
And I think the definition that I have for regime opposition is very different with that of Khan. You know, I think, if I'm not wrong, you consider MEK as a legitimate opposition, which you often refer to in
You
your
are wrong.
pieces.
You are wrong.
Um,
You are completely wrong on that, by the
and
way.
then
You're
so-
completely wrong.
Okay, and then
So,
so I think they
number
have
one.
different. So I think the problem is that some people see Iran as black and white, and that is not the case. I disagree with James on that. It is not. It wasn't Obama's election that changed things. I think it was. I give a lot of credit to Obama because I think if it was another U.S. president, the whole thing would not have happened.
And if I can step in, I think that the parallel tracks of having a Rouhani in Tehran, having an Obama in Washington, Iran and the United States found themselves at a moment where there were, both countries, have hardliners, moderates who are very much opposed about how to deal with the other, have opposing views on this deal. So I think this is something that, if we agree that it's too soon to tell, how this is going to bear out regionally vis-a-vis Iran-U.S. relations, both countries have elections coming up next year. So there's a presidential election coming up in the States. There will be a parliamentary election in Iran. How will this fare, a year down the line, depending on what happens in either country? And I'm struck by also the contrast between your view, Jamie, about this is an arms control agreement, and your view, Kasra. And I think many of us who think, in Iran, this is profound. This is the beginning of the end to, the years of mistrust with the United States. The hopes are endless. So in addition to what is the trajectory, given the domestic election prospects in each country, what would it take for it to be that moment for the United States? What will it take from Iran?
Well, look, I think I started by saying if I were an Iranian, I would be very excited.
Yeah.
And I would think it was a very big deal. I think I said that, and I mean that. But for an American, for a Westerner, the nuclear issue was one part of the problem, but not the main problem. The main problem is Iranian foreign policy, Iran's revolutionary exporting of its regime. And imagining that regime was going to get nuclear weapons meant we can't even do anything until we put a block on the nuclear weapon. But that's not, there are countries that have much larger capability than Iran to make a nuclear weapon, South Korea, Japan, etc., that we don't worry about their capability. We worried about Iran's capability because of their behavior in the region. And what it would take would be, let's start with Syria. The whole world is now realizing that the war in Syria and the ISIS that has resulted from that war and from President Obama pulling the troops out of Iraq and President Bush invading Iraq in the first place. Remember, everybody, now, there is a state sponsor of terrorism called Iraq now. It's just called ISIS. Dick Cheney was right. He was just 13 years too soon. And so what would it take? It would take them adjusting in a significant way their foreign policy, their revolutionary exporting of instability, and in the case of Assad, hundreds of thousands of people dead and millions of lives ruined and instability, and just imagine the blowback. We've saw these little stories the last few days about these refugees, half of whom are from Syria. Do you know, for the rest of all of our natural lives, there are going to be Syrian families who went through the war, who thought the West was going to help them, who are going to be angry. And a big chunk of that blame belongs to the leader of the Al-Quds unit, Mr. Soleimani,
Yes.
and the leader of the Revolutionary Guards and others who, without whom Assad probably would have fallen by now.
Well, do you think it's the case, Kasra, that for some factions in Iran, that there are different factions in Iran around this, who have different views of what this deal means, and we can call it the pragmatic moderate faction of Zarif, Rouhani. Do they see this as kind of a means to, eventually perhaps moderating, shifting, recasting Iran's policies in the region?
Absolutely. I think that's what they are hoping, and that's what they are aiming at. Whether they're going to get there, I'm not sure. We have to wait and see how things will play out. But my own impression is that it's going to be difficult for them, in a sense that the hardliners have been forced to give up something big. And circumstances have forced them to do that, but they're not going to relent on other issues. In fact, if anything, they're going to be pushing more on those areas that they have been active and they want to push forward on than before. The foreign policy, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, all those, Iraq, all those places, hardliners are going to push harder than before in going all out in what they were doing, extending Iran's reach beyond that region. So that's on their agenda. That's the least, and hopefully, I suppose they are hoping that they can somehow manage to salvage something from this nuclear program. But as Jamie is saying, it's very difficult to hide a nuclear program because of the technical issues. Given what they have signed up to, and assuming that they're going to stick to that agreement, then for my money, I think that they will not have the capability to build a bomb. They've given up on that. They're going to concentrate on other things. And let's not forget, giving up on this nuclear program was a pretty popular thing within Iran. It's only the hardliners and people like in the office of Khomeini, and probably he himself wanted it. Normal, ordinary Iranians didn't want to have anything to do with this nuclear thing. And the cost of it, hundreds of billions of dollars, to put it mildly, actually, I think probably more. Nobody has worked that out. The cost of this program to the Iranians. So they're very happy. Mr. Rouhani, others, the moderates, ordinary people are very happy to see the back of this nuclear program, and they are nearly there. They have signed up to something that will see to it that it will not come back again, hopefully, if they stick to that program. So for Mr. Rouhani, the moderates, the government, all those people, I saw Rouhani giving a press conference the other day, and he came across as pretty sort of relaxed, confident. He was joking. He was happy. And my first thought was that this is a man who has achieved something. And let's not forget, he has. When he came to power, he talked about getting rid of sanctions in a couple of months, in a few months. Okay, it didn't take a few months. It took him 2 years to do that. But he has done it, more or less. He has put the economy that was, you're talking about 40% inflation, back on track. The rate of growth was -7 almost when he took over, and now is +3%. So he's put the thing back on track to to recovery, and obviously this is the dividend of what he's been doing with the nuclear thing and other things. So he's hoping to reap the benefit of this. Whether he will be allowed to do that, whether the hardliners are going to allow him enough space to make that work, we have to wait and see.
I wanted to ask you, Khan, about I think regionally, of course, this is going to be the difficult and intractable part of all of this playing out is the relationship with Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudis are absolutely, besides themselves at this deal. We've seen from the files that came out in WikiLeaks recently that, Saudi Arabia has dedicated, vast sums of money in recent years to undermining Iran, sees Iran as a threat, has, since the revolution. Whose job is it to calm down the Saudis? To some extent, is it the job of the West? Saudi Arabia and Iran, both countries with agency, they can, is there a chance of them being able to have some sort of discussion about a regional security framework? I mean, how to deal with the question of Saudi Arabia and all of this?
Well, it's a good question. King Salman is going to Washington at the weekend, if my memory serves me correctly, and the Saudis are now going to engage very actively with the international community. I think the Saudis would be in a far more difficult position if we could really reassure them with a straight face that, as Zafra's saying, the regime has actually given up on its nuclear aspirations. I mean, one of the biggest problems of this, with the process that went on at Lausanne and then Geneva, is the IAEA put a lot of questions to Iran about what it had been up to in the past and got no answers. And in fact, for those of you amongst the journalistic community, we actually had a scoop here tonight with my dear friend Jamie Rubin, who's actually justified the invasion of Iraq because it persuaded Iran to give up what was then an active nuclear weapons program. So well done, Jamie.
Always willing to help you out.
Yeah, I know. Well, I knew we'd get there in the end. And of course, Gaddafi also had the same response, and where is he today? But I mean, the problem is, has the regime given up on this? And I come back to the point I made earlier about the verification process, because this is not a done deal. Rouhani can't go around saying, I've fulfilled my election promise. You are going to get the sanctions lifted. We are going to have $100+ billion coming into our coffers. We can rejoin the Committee of Nations. This is still to be worked through. And I think, the Saudis in Washington this weekend and next week, well, we've asked them some very hard questions about this. But coming back to your question about, the responsibility to reign in Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia would be a lot less agitated if they didn't see the Iranian Revolutionary Guards backing the Houthi rebels on their southern border in Yemen, where the Houthi rebels have overthrown a democratically elected government. They'd be a lot less stressed if they didn't see Mr. Soleimani and his friends running around Baghdad and the rest of it on their northern border. And they'd also be a lot more content if the Iranians just gave up on the murderous dictator Assad and let the Syrian people decide their fate rather than having their fate imposed on them by Iran. Those are just some thoughts.
Okay. Well, just for the record, I think the Saudi question is a wide and a complicated one. I think that the Saudi-Iranian regional rivalry goes back decades.
Well, it's sort of
predates all of this, and that Saudi has been pumping billions of dollars across the world promoting Salafi Islam since the 70s, not before Qasem Soleimani's career even began. But I'm sure we will deal with that. We're gonna open the floor up to questions in a moment. But I wanted to ask Saeed one question first before we do that about the domestic situation and how this is viewed. We've had news of Iranian human rights activists coming out in broad support of this. Civil society, how is this viewed within Iran? 80 million population, young, educated, open to the world. How do they see this? What will this portend for them?
Just last week we had, there was a video campaign by some of Iran's most respected human rights activists. Many of them were jailed for many years. At least some of them are still in jail, and they send messages, not video, but audio messages, and they supported the deal. Some people in the U.S., play on the human rights card and say, what about human rights in Iran, and they want to portray it as if the opposition in Iran, the human rights activists, are not supporting it, and that was a good signal that the deal has the backing of the very big range of people in Iran. And of course, James, from an American perspective, this is a hype, because it's...
This is what?
This is a hype, you mentioned, because it was Iranian people who were taken hostage by sanctions for years, and then even having problems with getting life-saving medicines because of sanctions and all these things. People like me were not, there's no way to send money or receive money from families in Iran. Students in Iran had no way of getting international journals. Iranian students in academy, in universities across the world were expelled sometimes from universities because of sanctions or misrepresentation of sanctions. So, of course, for an American perspective, it might be an overstatement, but for an Iranian perspective, this is very important. And lastly, this deal is not about Iran's human rights. It's not about Iran's poor human rights record, because Iran has an appalling human rights record. It's not about Israel's secret nuclear arsenal. This deal is not about U.S. waterboarding techniques. This deal is not about Saudi Arabia or Yemen. This deal is about the nuclear deal, and it means a lot to Iranians.
Do you want to come back quickly?
Yeah, very quickly. It's always I've always found it interesting that sanctions are blamed for problems. Sanctions are put on countries for reasons that are usually justified. They may not succeed in achieving their objective and getting the policies changed, but I would argue that the problems that you describe the Iranian people went through, and I sympathize with you, are not the fault of the world, but they're the fault of the regime for violating the rules of the International Atomic Energy, for hiding their nuclear weapons programs without reporting them, for not answering the questions that Khan has talked about their nuclear program in advance, and for scaring the world to believe that a regime that broke, international rule after international rule, whether it's in Argentina or Lebanon or where else, excuse me, you're welcome to ask your question, but let me just get my point out. That the world decided, it's not the United States, the world decided that this was dangerous. And it was so dangerous that sanctions were put on. So that's why sanctions were put on.
And history has shown that the world has not necessarily been, right in all aspects.
Well, the sanctions seem to have worked. You like the agreement, right?
We're going to open it to the floor now. I think sanctions I think it's very sensitive. Is it collective punishment? Should, the Iranian middle class be devastated because of the behavior of the regime? It's a difficult issue, and I'm sure that you will raise things like this. Right here.
Hi, my name is Rosalind Bain. I made a film for BBC World in Persian on the history of Iran's nuclear capability. This is a background. All of you have spoken as if the deal is between the United States and Iran. It's not. And I think it's worth actually having a look at what's been completely missed out, which is the European powers and what they've done. Part of it has been that Europe were drawn into the sanctions because they felt in the end that was the only way to go. I wouldn't say that European wanted to go that way, but they went in the end. Now, I think it will be extremely difficult if the United States would back out of it, which I don't think they will, because what we've already seen is that Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, has gone already to Tehran with his businessmen in order to start opening up business. It reminds me of something which also I've made lots of films about, which is Cuba. You know, this idea that you get Europe in, you do a lot of business with it, and so forth and so on, and albeit ridiculous time later, the United States will follow. So I think that when you're calibrating about this particular deal, and when people look at what you might do when you draw out, I don't think that European cooperation that was had before will occur again, in my opinion, but I'd be interested in what the panel thinks.
Do you have a question for us about that?
Well, I suppose, did you think Europe had a part to play? And in this sense, is this now what will happen? Because I don't think you'll get Europe back in on that, unless there is a very obvious breaking of the agreement.
Well, I do think this deal was actually a deal between Washington and Tehran. And I think when you look at what's been going on, and Obama writing letters to the Supreme Leader, I don't know if anybody noticed this, but the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has the sort of final say on a lot of matters in Iran, his response to the deal was to tweet a picture of President Obama with a gun to his head, apparently committing suicide. I mean, this is the sort of nonsense that lies behind what we're talking about here. But let us not forget, and Jamie will know more about this with his American connections, the American president has had a dialogue with the regime since he came to power, and he sort of made that Cairo speech and said, look, let's start again. The Europeans, and particularly the French and the British, had a rather robust view on the Iranian negotiations. And in my view, having followed this quite closely for the last decade, we have capitulated. And we have this ludicrous proposition at the weekend where Philip Hammond, our Foreign Secretary, goes to Tehran, not with a lot of businessmen, I think there were 10 on his plane. The French have taken 100, the Germans have taken thousands. I mean, we are bit players in the rush for Iranian assets. But, he goes to the embassy. Why did we break off relations? Why did we close the embassy in 2011? Because it was ransacked by the Revolutionary Guards.
True.
And Little Britain said, well, we are not going to go back until at the very least you redecorate it, make it all nice.
And
Sorry, let me just finish my point. That didn't happen. We paid for the redecoration, and even the redecoration wasn't sorted, so that our Foreign Secretary is standing in front of a portrait of our monarch, our head of state, with "Death to Britain" scribbled across her face. I mean, this is the level of appeasement we've bowed to. But to answer your point, we've completely given in to the Americans. If this is what Obama wants, we don't have the fight to do anything else. There are too many other problems, and we will just tuck in behind the American tailwind.
were the Europeans completely irrelevant?
No, I don't think the sanctions would have bitten in terms of the financial and the corporate sanctions and restrictions and overall effect without the Europeans doing that list and their participation. And so that was one of the tools that made them put pressure on them. But I don't want to exaggerate the degree to which sanctions caused them to make this deal, because I've tried to explain that this was a compromise on both sides. And you're right, you call it capitulation. I kind of call it realism.
I've got worse
when
words.
you've beaten your head against the wall for 10 years, you realize they were not going to give up all their centrifuges. They were not going to give up their entire program. They had invested too much of their prestige and, as you say, hundreds of billions of dollars. So the question was it worth getting some controls on the program, getting some additional ways of monitoring it, making it harder for them to build a bomb, easier for us to verify it if they tried, in exchange for lifting of the sanctions? And remember, this $100 billion, I'm sorry, this is going to make me seem soft, it's their money that's been frozen. I mean, it's not like anybody's handing them $100 billion. It's their money that was frozen with the help of the Europeans.
To the floor.
My name is Adam Smallman. I work for an investment bank. Con, I read your stuff very closely, and I'm slightly surprised by your view. Why is it a better bet for us to ally with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who seem a much more explicit threat to our security, than it is to deal with a country like Iran, who a few moments ago you described them as having to fulfill their election promise?
This is a great question, and it brings us back to my point about Saudi. Who is the purveyor of the greatest instability?
I think you're sort of misquoting me, but anyway, what my argument has been that we have traditional allies in the Gulf who for the last 30 or 40 years have secured our energy supply, and we'd be rather bonkers to just let them float in the winds because of this half-baked deal that Obama's drawn up. That's my argument. I'm not saying let's jump into bed with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but I'm glad you read my articles.
Here at the front.
Thanks. My name is Dariush. I'm a political scientist. I'm just going to begin by an amusing Freudian slip that I heard from James right now, that Iran went to war with Iraq, which was really hilarious. But the question here that I don't see just all across the board is that nobody is asking the question, why did it ever come to this? From the very beginning of it. And nobody is asking why, forget about what Iran is doing, whatever character the regime has got. And to some extent you sort of provided your answer when you were having your final debate with Saeed. But the question is this, why did this regime ever, from the very beginning of it until today, come to the point of this nuclear program, building this, whether it's weaponized or non-weaponized, or it's peaceful or non-peaceful? Why did it ever come to this? Under what circumstances, in what context is that happening? Because many of the elements we're missing here is the context of the region, the different countries around them, what the Americans have been doing, not in the past 10 years, but in the past 50 years, but all around the globe. It's all part of the same scenario. You're excluding every other element. We're just focusing on something which is talking about a one standard narrative of the Iranian nuclear program. And that is, I think, the narrative is missing. Why did it come to this?
Can you pinpoint that question just a little bit more, though? I mean, do you want
to
talk
about why did the Iranian regime ever come close to this nuclear program, whether it's...
We've predated, the nuclear program predated the revolution. How far do you want us to go back? I mean,
from 2003 onwards. In 2003, it stopped, they came to an agreement, and then everything collapsed. I think Mohammad al-Baradei responded to that, Jacques Cousteau responded to that the Westerners actually stabbed them in the back.
First of all, I don't know about no Freudian slip, but I will say.
Iran went to war with Iraq.
No, I was. The point. I don't. We'll have to check the tape on that. But what I was making, the point I was making, and I think you'll remember this, is that the Iranians were prepared to withstand a long war with Iraq, and were not going to give up their nuclear program completely. That was the point in which I discussed the Iran-Iraq war. So I don't understand why you would focus on the Freudian slip. I was trying to give the Iranian regime credit, and this is important, because they were not going to give up the entire program. They were not going to limit to a little laboratory. They had invested enormous prestige. Hundreds of billions of dollars had been suspended, and they probably spent, I don't know, $10 billion on the program. All right, now why did they build their nuclear weapons program? You know, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. But let me address the main point. This regime came about in 1979. Now, there's a lot of Iranians in this room, and we could go on forever about what happened in 79 and 53, in World War II, and go back forever. But what we know is in that the modern era, this regime has been a net minus to the security of the world through their support of global terrorism. When George Bush and Dick Cheney talked about a terrorist state with nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, they invaded the wrong country in their context. Iran is the largest sponsor of global terrorism. You know, America may have done some terrible things in the world, and I'm sure you love that. But and I know that people in this room think that. But in terms of classic arguments about terrorism, it's not even a close call. And they have long been building a nuclear program. They were beginning to weaponize it in the early 2000s, and they made a decision. We don't know why, and maybe they'll come tell you someday, but around 2003, we saw a change.
Should we like?
Can I-
And that's important.
I think those people with a bit of a long memory of Iranian history, they know what happened during Iran-Iraq war. It was a pretty bloody war. Iran nearly lost the war. Towards the end of that war, in the late 80s, Iran was forced basically to agree to a ceasefire with Saddam Hussein because things weren't going its way. Iraqis were still threatening Iran after 8 years, seriously. Iran didn't have the resources to withstand any more pressure, let alone another offensive, another attack from the Iraqis. So they agreed to that. Ayatollah Khomeini famously agreed to that and made a statement saying that it was like drinking a poisoned chalice. That basically ended his political life. He died as a broken man a couple of years later. That was a big lesson for Iran. Iran didn't have the capability to withstand this neighbor who didn't have that much of a real power, really. So within the Iranian regime, there were debates about what to do, how to go forward towards the end of the war. There is this famous letter by the commander of the Revolutionary Guards saying that if we want to continue the war, we will have to have thousands of tanks, we have to have thousands of fighter planes, we will have to have a nuclear weapon, we have to do this, we have to do that, which was, all of this was impossible for Iran to get its hands on. And that was the beginning. This is answer to your question, how we got here. That was the reason, that's why they decided to at least start to have this option of nuclear weapons, start working on that. And this is where we are. And on top of that, you had the situation whereby Iran, for all reasons, whether terrorism, supporting terrorism, or this, that, the other, Iran was being threatened, rightly or wrongly, by Israel, by the United States, by others in the region, every 5 minutes. So if you were a leader of Iran, what would you do? The whole stability, the whole raison d'etre, the whole regime was at stake. What do? You don't have the resources to fight a big war against the United States or even Israel. What do? So this seemed at the time a good idea, a deterrent that would stop Israel, the United States, and others to threaten Iran every 5 minutes. Yeah? So this is how we got here, and the rest is history, as you know.
Thank you, thank you. I thought that's a really crucial bit of context
Key
to
point.
our
Well done.
whole discussion. You know, an 8-year war in which Iran's only real ally was Assad.
Yes.
So there's a history to everything, as dark as it is.
Israel sold them some weapons, as I remember. Iran-Contra, anybody remember that?
And Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear facility at that time as well. So there's massive involvement from Israel to make sure that Iraq...
And let's not forget the thousands of teenagers that were sent to the minefields to clear them out.
Yeah, you got the
Yes,
mic.
I do.
Yeah? Okay.
My name is Rana Rahimpour, colleague of Kasra at BBC Persian. Some analysts believe that situation in the Middle East is changing and Iran has the potential of becoming the next US ally in maybe near future. It's interesting that we are all criticizing Iran's foreign policy. No one's talking about Saudi Arabia's foreign policy, the money that is being channeled to ISIS, the money that is being given to the so-called moderate opposition in Syria. And they also have a role in the migrant crisis that we're seeing at the moment. So Iran, do you think that Iran in near future has the potential of becoming a U.S. ally? Because some analysts believe that.
Well, let me answer that directly. No, I don't. I know President Obama does talk about Iran's ability to be a regional power, but an ally of the United States, given the policies they pursue, whether it's in Damascus, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's towards Israel. Now, I know very well that Iran's policy is not to annihilate Israel with nuclear weapons, as some people would suggest. But they do believe that Israel shouldn't exist because there should be an election and Israel should end up as part of a larger Arab entity. And I understand that. So those are the reasons why Iran, I mean, I could go on for a while. All of the Khobar towers killing American soldiers, etc. You know, everyone will say America's terrible, terrible. But this is from the American perspective. You asked, would America want to be an ally of Iran? So, no, I don't think so. And I think to get at your question, you know, look, ISIS is currently the worst threat we face in the world, bigger than Iran's nuclear weapons capability.
And its greatest source of private donations come from Saudi Arabia.
Well, these facts always seem to be provided by those who want the United States to be allied with Iran.
U.S. General
No,
wrote this last week. There was a letter
There's some people who believe that, but what I want to tell you right now is that if Assad had not survived because of Iran, ISIS in Syria would not have the power it now has. So it's all pretty messy in the Middle East. And for those of you who don't regard Western policy as all terrible, I'd like you to imagine that it's after 9/11. We've all been sensitized to the potential danger of global terrorism. The Iraq War hasn't happened yet, and that's a big if, but it's an important point to think about ISIS. And we knew that there was a place with half of Syria and a third of Iraq, controlling billions of dollars, tens of thousands of committed warriors, an ideology that's intended to kill as many people, and doing what we've seen them do on the video machine. Wouldn't the Western world have gathered together a ground force and invaded this place and killed them all, frankly? And I think after 9/11, I think they would have. That's my point. I didn't say whether it's a good idea or not. I'm talking about the commitment of the West after 9/11. They were prepared to invade Iraq, which was a much farther stretch. But we're now talking about a place in the middle of the Middle East where these people are going and they want to kill us all. So what's really changed, and this is the sad part, is that the Iraq War has so weakened the West in its willingness to act that a genuine threat has now come. Not Iraq, which was exaggerated, but a genuine threat. And we're plinking with airstrikes. We're not willing to do anything. The world is watching these people do all the things, and I could go on and on and on. You all know the atrocities that they've committed. And I think that's not Iran's fault, and it's not Saudi Arabia's fault.
Can we take a round of questions? Why don't we do that? Why don't we do about 3 or 4? I'll write them down, see who can respond, and then we can get through them more quickly. You've been waiting a long time, and also here in the front, Millie, after. Yeah.
Hi. There's many questions I would obviously like to ask, but my question is, I guess, for everybody but James, because we share an accent and therefore perhaps too many opinions. But overall, what do you think, and something I'm really shocked to hear hasn't been mentioned so far, is what do you think Iran hopes to benefit from this in the long run in terms of particularly oil and gas markets? I mean, when you mentioned that Iran can't potentially be a U.S. ally, I work as an analyst studying Eurasia. I see a lot of opportunity for it to be a European ally, particularly in gas markets against Russia, and we often don't hear enough from Iran how they feel about these things, so maybe that's for Saeed.
Oil and gas, thank you. And then in the front as well.
Thank you. Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. So that, for a start, might tell you where I'm coming from. I've been totally opposed to these mega death machines ever since they were launched on the the world in 1945, and I'm totally opposed to anybody's possession of nuclear weapons now. Now, talk about Iran as a danger. Well, I agree that the question of Iran's foreign policy is a separate issue from the specific nuclear one, which has been dealt here. The fundamental reason why anybody wants nuclear weapons is because they have a belief that it has.
Right, we need a question.
Sorry, the format in these meetings I've always been to has been this a general discussion, not
Is that right?
restricted to questions.
If you could accelerate towards your question, we would appreciate it.
Sorry, I'm making what I believe is a vitally important point. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has been in existence, in operation, in force, for 45 years. Article 6 of that calls on, obliges the 5 existing nuclear powers at that time to negotiate in good faith towards the end of the nuclear arms race and towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. There have never been such negotiations since in those 45 years, and they are still not ongoing now. So the fundamental reason why anybody wants nuclear weapons. No, I'm not asking a question.
Sir,
I'm
we're going to have you wrap it up.
Right.
There's
Sorry,
so many people waiting.
I'm making a contribution to the debate.
Much appreciated, but that's all we gave this.
Only
lovely
because
lady from the BBC
there
also
is a
made
belief that nuclear weapons have some military and or political utility. I deny that proposition, but nevertheless, that is the reason why anybody wants nuclear weapons, and that is fostered by the among others, the UK government.
And I appreciate your intervention because there are many in Iran who would agree, think that Iran should not have nuclear power at all, that its energy resources don't require that. There's an environmental movement, so thank you. There are many there who share your views. So on to a couple more. We'll take a round. Thank you.
Very short question. Ewan Grant, I'm old enough to remember the Paul Erdman book, The Crash of '79. Very funny but serious book about the Shah's nuclear program. My question, it's a very short question, is what do you see for a conventional arms race and maybe subversion on both sides, Sunni and Shia? What do you see the immediate, near-term and long-term consequences of very advanced conventional weapons arriving in the region, particularly Russia's S-300 missiles, where it looks that they are finally going to deliver them to Iran?
So you mean regional arms race, potential for a conventional? Yes. Okay, thank you.
And possibly spilling into subversion and guerrillas.
Okay, thank you.
A very short question. Would this nuclear deal lead to the reinstitution of Sykes-Picot borders in the region?
Dream on.
Sykes-Picot.
Let's keep it uncomplicated this evening. Okay, great. Should we go to you, Said, with oil and gas? What are the prospects? How does Iran hope to benefit? Its oil and gas is dilapidated. It doesn't have good refining capacity. Tell us.
I tried to address all of them short, but first with the NPT.
No, please don't go to NPT.
Okay. As you know, sanctions have not been lifted yet. So, but the Europeans, French, Italians, Brits have gone to Iran, for bigger deals. I don't think that there would be much prospect of an oil deal between Iran and the US. But Iran is increasingly going to depend on tax rather than oil on its national income. For many years, Iran it is still an oil-dependent economy, but because of sanctions, because it couldn't sell oil, it is trying to get tax revenues going up, and the more tax you pay, the more democracy you have in the country. So whether that would be a good thing for the future of Iran, I think it would be a good thing. On the S-300, on the arms sale.
Well, why don't we? Should we? It'll take a long time if you each address each question.
Yeah.
Or
I'll
quickly
say
and then
very quickly.
Yeah? Okay.
Very quickly, Iran's defense budget is minimal compared to that of Saudi Arabia, which is now buying more arms than any other country in the Middle East. So that's not Iran's fault. If there is a arms race, if there is anything like that, the S-300 is just a big name. It's not anything compared to what the French are selling to the Saudis or what Brits are selling. It's nothing even compared.
It's the most sophisticated anti-aircraft missile system.
No, of course
in the
you
world.
need it. Iran is the only.
Yeah, but don't downplay it.
Yeah, Iran is the
It's
only.
a very high-tech piece of kit.
Iran is the only country. Yeah, Iran is the only country with some stability in the region. Nowhere else in the neighborhood has any stability. So, of course, it needs defense system. Why is it wrong?
But is there a prospect for a region? I mean, it's often said, if Iran,
As far as Iran is concerned, I don't think there is this question of arms race, a conventional arms race at the moment. Not so far as Iran is concerned, anyway, because Iran is under arms sanctions already and will be for the foreseeable future. Iran cannot sell arms or buy arms from neighboring countries, from any country, in fact. And this whole S-300 deal, I think it's basically a sideshow in a sense that Russians have been paid $1 billion or something for these missiles, and they've been paid several years ago. They have to deliver, and now they found an opportunity to do that, and it goes against the Vienna Agreement anyway, because they're not supposed to sell these things for another 6 or 7 or 8 years, whatever it is. And it's not going to change the strategic picture in Iran in any big way. I agree, it's a big, very sophisticated system, but it's not going to change the strategic picture in any way. I don't think that arises at the moment. My fear is this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia that is playing itself out in the region. That is the main issue. I was in Iraq not long ago, and everyone you met and talked to, people who should know the situation pretty well. I mean, the top political leaders, top religious leaders in the country. The whole sort of argument there was that everything that is going on in the region has its roots in this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Whether it's in Iraq these days, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's wherever in this region. And that, the general view in Baghdad was that these things are going to get worse. In fact, I didn't see anybody who saw any hope for the future in Iraq. The situation, it's so dire. You don't realize it unless you're there and you see it with your own eyes and you see it close up, how serious it is. And there's no hope. People are losing hope in a major way. And they see these two major powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, fighting in their own area, in their country, and there's no end to this. And I remember I talked to a very senior religious leader, Shiite religious leader in Iraq, who was telling me that this cannot go on. Iran and Saudi Arabia have to sit together and sort this out. Okay, the divide, the gap is so much, it's not easy. But I think it's probably the job of international community, the big powers, the US, others, to push these two together. Now that we have an opportunity, that the Iranians in fact have promised to cooperate if there is a deal in Vienna, which there was a deal in Vienna, now use this opportunity to push these two together, to come to some kind of, at least start talking, come to some kind of a deal that you get rid of this, the rivalry that is the root cause of all these issues.
So if you know if there's an elephant in the room, it's Iran and Saudi Arabia under all of these discussions.
Can I just have a quick word on this?
We're supposed to stop at 8:30 and we have left Sykes-Picot.
We'll go to
Sykes-Picot, and
She
there's
asked
a
me to
couple of
just
people who've been really patient.
Sykes-Picot, it is a curious fact that the British will not bomb in Syria, but they will bomb in Iraq.
We
And
will
that's
bomb
where
in American planes, but not in our own.
But no, they won't bomb in Syria, which is French under Sykes-Picot, and they will bomb in Iraq, which is British under Sykes-Picot. But let me just touch on the big elephant, and I'll be very brief. The use of force and the willingness to spread instability and undermine your neighbor is not a question of how good a tank is or how good an S-300 air defense system. It's a question of will and a willingness for soldiers to die. And Iran has a lot of that, even if it doesn't have a lot of weapons. And it's true, the Arab regimes dwarf Iran in conventional capability, dwarf them. If you did the numbers, it's billions and billions. But let's face it, most of those regimes are not that comfortable sending their militaries into battle for whatever reason. And I don't want to say anything derogatory. But the Iranian regime has sent units to most of the theaters in the region to fight and die for the revolution and their greater cause, whatever that may be. And that's a lot more important than how expensive your tank is or how sophisticated your S-300 is.
The number of Iranians, going to wars and being ready to be killed is not even compared to that of Americans.
We're not talking about America. I know you want to, but that's not the question.
Can I just
And then-
quickly turn this?
There's just been one person who's been so patient at the back. If you want to respond to him and then chime
Why
in.
aren't we talking about America?
Fine, ask
It is
me
the
about America.
It is the superpower has brought mess in the region. Why
Ask
not
me
talk
about
about
America.
it?
We're talking
Why
about
blame
Iran versus Saudi Arabia.
Why
That
blame
was the
Iran
question.
on the refugees of Syria? Why? Excuse me?
I'm just saying that the
the
question is
Saudis-
Iran
one
versus
second,
Saudi Arabia,
one second.
that's all.
The Saudis go and bomb the Twin Towers.
The Saudis didn't bomb.
Excuse
Saudi
me, 90% of them were
15 out of
Saudi
19,
citizens.
just to be
It's
Was
not
there,
Saudi Arabia
was
that
there
didn't do
Iranian
it.
citizen there? Did you find the Iranian citizen in the planes that bombed America? No. Did you find any Iranians doing any suicide bombing anywhere? No.
Khobar, yes.
No.
Hezbollah in
Yes, Iran
in
has got the
Lebanon,
right
yes.
to look after its interests in countries like Lebanon, in countries like
Yeah,
Syria,
how about the
Saudi
poor
Arabia.
guy in
But let's,
Cafe Milano?
let's please not be low enough to blame the refugees that are created by a war that you have started.
Could you ask the question though, so we can respond to it?
I just want to ask one simple question.
Okay,
You know, if America is not to blame, that's all that is that happening in the Middle East, and Iran is so capable of destabilizing all the superpowers in the Middle East, then who is to blame? If America is not to blame.
Can I have a quick word?
Who is to blame?
Yeah.
I have a quick word.
It's all America's fault. It's all America's fault. Okay, do you feel better now? People have been blaming America in this part of the world for the beginning of time, okay? It's not going to solve your problems. George Bush made some terrible mistakes, and the world has suffered for them.
Except for Iraq.
In Iraq, okay? But Iran's government has made some terrible mistakes, and people have suffered for it. And right now, the terrible mistake is being made in Syria. And millions of people are dying because of Iran's mistake.
Nobody is
I
saying
think we're
that.
going to draw to a close now. It's been a very lively evening. I'm sorry. It's been wonderful questions from the floor. Thank you to the panel for all of their insights.
Hey,
before you all go, in with the revolution